I think we should begin. So, hello, my name is Peter Stood. I am the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities here at Ontario Tech University, and welcome to Ontario Tech University's first Critical Climate Week, which began last evening with a showing of a film called Eating Ourselves to Extinction. We had a very nice crowd that watched the film and learned a lot from it, I'm sure. We're focusing this year on methane as the often overlooked greenhouse gas. And it's a very important, I think, time to do this. I'll explain that in a moment. But this is a joint effort really between my faculty, the Office of Campus Infrastructure and Sustainability at Ontario Tech University, and the Canadian NGO named Common Earth, which offers perspective-changing courses, taking a systems approach to understanding the roles we all play in the climate crisis. I'd like in particular to thank Mr. David Peterson, who I believe is here, David Patterson, who is the founder and has helped sponsor this week of critical climate awareness. So we had a very short video we were going to show you. Joe, if you wanted to put that on, please.
This year, NASA released a new visualization modeling the sources and transport of methane across our globe. With this new visualization, we can see how methane sources vary by location and season. In South America, the Amazon River basin and its adjacent wetlands flood seasonally. This creates an oxygen-deprived environment that is a significant source of methane. In the last 200 years, methane concentrations have more than doubled, mainly due to human activities. Europe is the only region to show a decrease in methane emissions over the last 20 years. In India and Southeast Asia, rice cultivation and livestock are two of the driving sources of methane. In China, economic expansion is driving a high demand for fossil fuels, resulting in an increase in methane emissions. This is a stark difference to the Arctic, where natural sources, such as natural wetlands and potentially thawing permafrost, account for more than 70% of the region's methane emissions. Taking a step back, we could see that methane has vastly different sources around the globe. By getting a better sense of the story of methane, scientists and policymakers can better understand the sources of methane emissions and work to reduce this greenhouse gas.
Okay, and thank you to NASA for that very brief video. Most of you will know, of course, that this is an historic week because COP29 is taking place in Azerbaijan, and of personal interest, my wife is on the plane there right now. She does a lot of work in climate and health, and we'll be in constant contact. The interesting thing that occurred, so yesterday, speaking of methane, last night there was a special summit on methane and non-CO2 greenhouse gases. That was the formal title of the summit. This was put on by the United States and China, during which, or immediately prior to, the United States unveiled new Environmental Protection Agency regulations, which would include fines for companies caught releasing excessive or unreported methane emissions. It's a key plank in the Biden administration's climate agenda. And of course, while it's celebrated in many quarters, it's overshadowed perhaps by concerns that it won't survive the transition in government in the United States in January. So we'll see what happens there. although we can predict it, I think, with some accuracy. At the same time, interestingly enough, a sensor on the International Space Station detected around 11 massive separate methane plumes on the shores of the Caspian Sea and inland less than 60 kilometers from Baku, which is the capital city of Azerbaijan, where the COP29 is taking place. Right? In other words, we've got much more methane in the world than we knew, or I should say in the atmosphere than we knew. And it's no stranger at all to the location where COP29 is taking place this week, where international leaders are trying to negotiate a solution to this problem. So we shouldn't overlook the impact of methane, of course, and I won't go into details on this. I think most people here are aware. It's in the short term a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon. And some would argue an easier one for us to get a grip on, and yet many sources of methane are quite beyond our control, as one of our panelists will no doubt discuss. Speaking of our panelists, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel tonight, which can help us make some sense of this and talk about some latest trends, perhaps, and also give us a bit of background. And incidentally, to the audience, if you do have questions to raise, please use the chat function, which you will find on the bottom right side of your screen. So our panel tonight consists of Professor Dan Hornvig. He is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science at Ontario Tech University. He worked for 20 years with the World Bank as lead advisor on cities and climate change, and was Chief Safety and Risk Officer for the Ontario Technical Safety Standards Association. We are also very pleased to have Gavin Schmidt join us as well. He is probably needs a little introduction to many of you, but he is the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He's also served as the acting senior climate advisor to the NASA administrator, and one of the most knowledgeable people about climate modeling probably on the planet. We're also very pleased to have Tanya Del Santro with us. Dr. Del Santro is an assistant professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Waterloo. And her very exciting research focuses on greenhouse gas dynamics in freshwater, including Canadian reservoirs and restored wetlands, which is obviously of increasing concern. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Timothy McNeil, who is a senior teaching professor in political science and directs the sustainability minor program here at Ontario Tech University. His research focuses on social, economic, environmental outcomes of development projects, largely in Canada and Latin America. So it's not an accident that we have a very interdisciplinary panel to discuss what is one of the burning issues of our time. So I'd like to just begin very quickly, if we can, with Dan. And we did have Dan, I think you had just a couple of slides you wanted to put up briefly. Maybe you could give us a bit of context on the increasing problem. We labeled this discussion, is there a methane crisis? That's a play, of course, because there's a climate crisis. And I doubt anyone would argue there isn't a methane crisis, but nonetheless. Perhaps, Dan, you could begin, just look at it a bit from an energy systems perspective as well. Why is methane such a serious systems challenge in your view?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. I guess perhaps to start, I gave my first talk in the first year that I worked for the city of Guelph, my first talk on climate change. And it was all rah, rah. We wanted to get the city up and running on the recycling program, and we were closing the landfill. And we said, hey, this is really important. We need to start recycling so that we can reduce CO2 and methane. And that was in 1987. And then the COP, that was the same year that our Common Future, the Brundtland Report, was published, which was sort of a call to arms for all the countries in the world that this was actually pretty serious and we all needed to act. It took the world 8 years before COP, the Conference of the Parties. The first one was convened in 1995 in Berlin. And as Peter said, we're on COP 29 now. We're about 30 years. And in those 30 years, we've released more greenhouse gas emissions than in all time up to that point. So the scale and the magnitude of which, the increase in CO2, and everybody knows the increase in CO2. This is a slide I show my second year energy engineering class almost every week now, and they're so tired of it. But it's the Keeling curve, which is among the most accurate readings of CO2 from Mauna Loa, the volcano in Hawaii. And I just checked today, it's at 423.3. And this is only, this is a month old. So you can actually watch the CO2 increase. And this is just something that terrifies me, I guess. Anyways, so I presented this along with a similar slide for methane, which is supposed to be easier to address and far more important for us to try and mitigate. I don't know if you have the next slide, but you can see that the increase in methane is actually faster than the increase in CO2. And and if you also plotted nitrous oxide, which is the third greenhouse gas, it's increasing just as fast. So all of this angst, all of this concern, and we're not really significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions at all. And methane is, as Peter said, probably the lower hanging fruit that we should be able to reduce, and we're not there yet. So I guess the point I wanted to make at the start is that we know what needs to be done, but we have not really started doing it yet. And as you mentioned, Peter, having a fossil fuel COP 29 is indicative of just how big of a challenge this is. So maybe that's something we can get into more tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I found the optics around COP 29 are depressingly familiar, to be honest. But
sadly.
Okay, so yeah, we see that the problem certainly is much bigger than, and we're further from, although there's many solutions out there, and there's a lot of technology devoted to this. And I thought this would be a nice way to bring Gavin into the discussion. And maybe you could comment on the role technology is playing today with methane detection. The initial findings from satellite technology are quite startling in recent years, indicating there's a much bigger problem than we even imagined. So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that at all from a NASA perspective.
I'm not quite sure about the bigger problem than we imagined. So we've been tracking concentrations of methane, which is the thing that causes radiative forcing, which is the thing that causes warming, as Dan showed in his graphs. We can track it through the ice cores. We can track it through the instrumental period, and indeed, it has been rising precipitously fast, and now it's over twice what it was in the pre-industrial. And we've been able to do that through flask measurements, and there's a global network that does that. What's new is the use of remote sensing. So it turns out that there are certain quite sharp frequencies where methane will absorb. And so when you're looking, and I think it's mostly reflected solar radiation, so the sun comes down and then it's reflected, and then you're looking at how much of that is absorbed by methane in the column, and you can see that, and you can detect that from space. And there's a number of satellites from both government sources and private companies that are now in orbit that are able to detect column methane signals that are significantly above background. Now, what that means is you can't detect slow changes in methane because of like large wetland areas or something like that, but you can detect plumes that are associated with leaks. Right, so leaks from oil and gas pipelines, leaks from mines, leaks from liquid natural gas, liquid natural gas facilities and the like, and they show up very, very clearly. The different sensors up there have different resolution. So there are some that are up there that have like 30-meter resolution, right? So they're looking very, very precisely, but they don't have enough bandwidth to take that for the whole planet, and so they only look where they're being told to look, right? So GHGSat, which is a Canadian company, has 4 satellites in orbit right now, and their business plan is to contract out their sensor technology to people who are running oil and gas facilities to check their facilities for leaks, right? So they pay them for that. They train their sensors on these locations. If they see any leaks, they report them, and then hopefully those people that just paid for that information will then fix those leaks. And it's very hard to detect these leaks apart from that, and so that's really a kind of game-changing technology. There's something similar on the International Space Station. The EMIT instrument is also able to see concentrations of methane, but it has a broader swath. So you're getting a global picture, but it's not as detailed. There is something that's kind of intermediate to that, which is methane-sat, which has been funded by the Environmental Defense Fund to do large-scale tracking, but again with a little bit more fidelity than we have. And so the idea that we'll be able to find point sources of methane now, that seems like a very strong reality, and that's very useful, because mostly these leaks are this is an economic product for these people, and a leak is just throwing money away, and so you'd think that they would fix them if they find them. There's some economic reasons why they don't always do that, but in principle they in fact should do that. And there's many different jurisdictions where people are being mandated to fix leaks that are being discovered this way. So that should help reduce emissions, but it isn't all of the emissions. It's not even all of the anthropogenic emissions, because it really needs to be very concentrated. So if you have a landfill, you might not see the leaks from a landfill. If you have cattle in pasture and you've had a big increase in cattle, well, you might not see the increased methane from the cows. You won't see the increase in methane from warming wetlands that then produce more methane. So so there's a limit to how useful those remote sensing capabilities will be. But as part of an overall kind of collection of data from in situ measurements, plane measurements, remote sensing, we may be able to get a much bigger picture and a much clearer picture of where methane is coming from.
Yeah, thank you. And just a quick follow-up then, is there an effort to further improve the technology so that we can get past the, only identifying the leaks and actually using this for more precise measurements of other sources?
Yes, but let me give you a sense of the challenge. Sure. Right next to a leak, you're actually looking at almost pure methane gas, right? And that's coming out. It dilutes quite quickly, but those plumes that you see that stretch for hundreds of meters and things, you're looking at concentrations there, maybe 10, 20 times background. And then if you're over a lake that is there's bubbles coming out of a lake, you're looking at something that is maybe a few percent above background. So the sensitivity that you would need to be able to see something diffuse as opposed to something acute like that is like a factor of 100. So we may get there, but it may take a while.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And yeah, I know there's some fascinating improvements being made in biodiversity monitoring, for example, which is more my area with remote sensing now. But I think, as you've described, it's very difficult to do this, to get across the non-anthropogenic as well causes. To which we turn now, if that's okay. And Tonya, I'll bring you into the discussion then. We usually think of agriculture, oil and gas as the main sources of methane emissions, and this is sort of the public image, but freshwater emissions are an increasingly important factor. Perhaps you could elaborate a bit on the significance, given eutrophication and climate change too, which is contributing to this. So it's anthropogenic, but it's not, right? Of freshwater methane emissions. Could you elaborate a bit, perhaps, on some of your fascinating work? I don't know if you're muted or not, Tanya. We're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So much for the tech check in the beginning. It worked.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Hold on.
Okay, if you can hear me okay. So what I was saying was that I'm going to bring it down to the ground a little bit, out of the remote sensing world a tiny bit. So yeah, I work on freshwaters. And in general, they only occupy, if you look at lakes, rivers, reservoirs, about 3% of our land covered. You add wetlands in there, it's another 10%. But together, according to some of the latest, global methane budgets coming out of the Global Carbon Project, together wetlands and freshwaters make up about 37% of global methane emissions. And we know wetlands is a huge part of that. So what's new and what's being recognized now more so is that we also have this issue of anthropogenic emissions from freshwaters. Now, a significant portion, we don't have a good idea of what this anthropogenic portion really is of freshwaters. Some of it's pretty obvious, like waters that we've created. Reservoirs, for example, where we dam a river and create a reservoir for hydropower or flood control. Those are obviously man-made. And then we have a lot of creation of smaller ponds. So we're doing a lot of restoration of wetlands on agricultural lands to prevent nutrient runoff into bigger water bodies, which has some downstream impacts, such as harmful algal blooms. We also have stormwater ponds in urban areas. And all of these man-made waters have been highly big methane emitters, let's say. So we find that the addition of nutrients, for example, from agriculture into waters really increases their methane emissions. And what we've also seen is that a lot of natural water bodies are becoming more what we call eutrophic, so more nutrients being entered into these systems and turning into higher methane emitters. And along with climate change, one of the issues is that we also see that we're going to have, with more warming, you essentially have more microbial activity, right? And that's what's producing a lot of this biogenic methane in these systems. You're going to have longer ice-off periods in the northern regions, so we'll end up emitting more from these waters. In general, you may have more anoxia, so more periods of where in the water columns have little to no oxygen, and these are ideal conditions for producing methane. In general, so one thing I can say is that just about every single body of water I've ever sampled, and I've sampled quite a lot, every single water body I've sampled, except for one like glacial stream, had supersaturated concentrations of methane. We go into every system that we go, we use some kind of chamber connected to a greenhouse gas analyzer, and we're looking to see if methane's being emitted from these systems. We can just simply go and measure the concentrations of the water and tell you that they're higher than what's in the atmosphere. So all of these waters are emitting methane almost all the time. They also emit CO2, but we have the counter, which is photosynthesis, takes up CO2. So there's a balance there. In terms of methane, though, we almost always in surface water see saturation of methane. which is interesting in and of itself.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess so. You're not looking at the melting of frozen tundra, but no doubt you're familiar that that's also a
Of
growing.
course, yes. And so I do have, yeah, plenty of colleagues that also work up in the north in Canada on
Mhm.
some of our extensive amounts of peatlands and wetlands that are up there. I mean, Canada has we have some of the world's largest concentration of wetlands. Yeah.
Mhm.
And as we foresee warming, which the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the globe, essentially, yeah, we do predict we'll see higher amounts of methane emissions from these systems.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So we'll circle around to talk a bit about solutions, of course. But for now, perhaps Professor McNeil, we could bring some social science into the picture if you wish. And you could give us an overview of the type of big picture policy measures that might be used to address methane pollution, and we can start shifting the emphasis away from the problem and into solutions. We haven't talked about agriculture too much, but we did show a film about that last night, and I think it's common knowledge. Agriculture, especially big agribusiness, is a major contributor of methane, in particular meat production, right? But there's many other sources, and none are too small to discuss, I think. And so, Tim, maybe you'd like to give us your overall picture right now.
Oh yeah, thank you. This is really fantastic for me to hear. I'm here less of a methane expert and more as somebody with some interesting questions. I think, really because my field of expertise is largely around the impacts on local communities and environments of sort of large scale development projects. And in studying one of these projects, which was a cruise ship port in Honduras, I kind of accidentally came across some issues related with methane. I started to do these sort of impact assessments, and then I thought, well, I have to really bring into, what do the cruise ships do here in general, not just on the community, but as far as the emissions are concerned. And I hit that, and I was kind of astounded. After seeing what cruise ships kind of do as far as just CO2 emissions, it seemed to me pretty absurd. I think an average large cruise ship emits the same as 12,000 cars, for example. You can blow half of the entire carbon budget, or sorry, an average European can blow half of their carbon budget for the year by just taking one 7-day cruise. So it's a massive sort of, it's not a huge industry, although it's always growing in Canada, but it's a big impact industry. Now, CO2, of course, is generally thought as the problem. There are other, especially sulfur oxide, but CO2 is the main issue people were concerned about with cruise ships, because they burn heavy fuel oil, and it's just really dirty. I should say, cruise ships, the discussion on cruise ships kind of goes parallel to the discussion on shipping in general, which of course gets into kind of big picture stuff, even bigger picture. Now, the incentive, I guess, to get into policy a little bit, of course, there's been incentives for cruise ships to kind of clean up their act as far as emissions, and it's fairly difficult to actually monitoring is incredibly difficult. So maybe Gavin has something to say about that, shipping in general, but they've through carbon taxes or the threat of future carbon taxes and whatnot, the industry has been trying to get down their footprint as far as CO2 is concerned. And that's good. And often this is through carbon taxes. But one thing that I noticed that I thought was quite problematic is the cruise industry has managed to become more efficient through using things like scrubbers and more efficient power plants and things like that. They're able to be more efficient in their use, and certainly per passenger, for example, they're able to release less CO2 into the atmosphere. So as they've becoming much more efficient as far as that's concerned. But at the same time, the overall impact of that industry has ballooned as they become more efficient at transporting passengers with less CO2 output. They've actually been more polluting more. Why? Because there's all sorts of incentives in the policy that when you get a carbon tax, for example, it can create a sort of perverse incentive to just grow the industry, because of course when you have a carbon tax, a business like a cruise ship business is not trying to reduce its overall CO2 output. They're trying to reduce the cost that they're paying for that CO2 output compared to their input. So what have they been doing? Of course, there's some tech solutions like carbon scrubbers and things like that. But the biggest thing they've been doing is building bigger and bigger cruise ships, because there's a carbon efficiency there. They can ship more people with a little less carbon, and they start to look much better as far as their efficiencies are concerned. So you get this kind of perverse situation where that industry starts polluting more as far as CO2 is concerned, while being cleaner on a per passenger basis. Now, in the sort of overall story of this, simultaneously, you get this idea that, oh, maybe there are better fuels out there. And of course, liquefied natural gas is becoming more common and therefore cheaper, but also had this aura about it for quite some time, about it being a cleaner alternative for a transition fuel. So in that industry, there's a movement to create sort of a huge amounts of ships, and this includes international shipping in general, to use liquefied natural gas, which is basically methane, right? And the latest example I have is called Icon of the Seas, which is this massive, the biggest cruise ship ever built. It's been nicknamed Human Lasagna because it's got 20 layers in which they store 7,000 passengers. And this is the result of this sort of upscaling to make, less per person carbon output, sorry. But this new ship is entirely fueled on liquefied natural gas. And then looking into it further, I noticed that the entire industry is talking about liquefied natural gas as a transition fuel. And this includes the larger shipping industry of shipping goods across the oceans. So the problem with the cruise ship industry, again, and the larger shipping industry, is that when you build a ship with a transitional fuel source, that ship is expected to last maybe 50 years. So your transition is a long period, just because those high fixed costs and what it takes to build a ship. So as far as policy is concerned, you do have, this is in a atmosphere of carbon taxing, but you do have other policies such as capping. Whether you're capping output of say methane or CO2, or whether you're, which I think should happen in the instance of the cruise ship industry, maybe just capping the size of that industry, or maybe even to be more radical about it, maybe there's just some industries we shouldn't have, and if there's an industry that we shouldn't have, maybe cruise tourism would be a good candidate for that kind of thing. So it seems there's a lot of baked in now transition fuel discourse in this industry, and there very much might be in sort of electrical grid stuff, power plants, etc. as well. I would be interested to hear that has this large fixed cost. You build a plant, it's called transitional, but it's going to last for 50 years or whatever. So that's where I sort of have accidentally stumbled onto this methane issue through the cruise ship issue.
Yeah, thanks. And shipping in general, I know for such a long time, it basically got a pass, right, when it came to international climate negotiations. So it's fascinating to see how that's evolved as well. So maybe, Dan, we'll go back to you then, and because Tim mentioned the energy, and you're an expert in energy systems. I'm just wondering How do you see LNG perhaps? How's that working in terms of, the impact that that's having, not just on the markets, of course, but also on driving policy itself? There's no question that, the leaks that we talked about before, this is an industry probably is replete, right, with these methane leaks that we see on occasion. How efficient is it? Not to use the word efficient in the wrong way, Tim, as you're suggesting as a policy tool, efficiencies, but maybe you could comment on that too, Dan. What's your take on the energy?
Sure. There was a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago. Gavin may be aware of it more, but it was a very good life cycle comparison of LNG and coal. And the argument has been, that LNG will be so much better. And this was LNG from the US shipped to replace coal in other countries. And it was almost a wash in terms of the emissions associated, both in terms of the liquefaction and then the shipping, and then leaks on the other side. There's quite a few good studies of the tertiary distribution of natural gas, depending on the city, can have lots of leaks. There's a very well-known study of both Boston and Washington, D.C., and there were actually places in Washington, D.C. that if you threw your cigarette, fortunately no one ever smokes anymore, but if you did and you threw it on the ground, there are places where it could actually explode. The methane concentration is that high. And this is actually one of the inherent benefits of something like a price on carbon, because it pushes everything and everyone to be more efficient. And the problem is that no matter how much we think we know, complex systems like the energy system always comes out with surprises. Everyone thought, well, LNG is way more efficient than coal, of course. But then if you look at it in a different way, you find out that maybe it's not. Whereas if we were to say, that, hey, for every X tons of CO2 or the methane equivalent, there's a price on that, and that will drive efficiency. And that's the economist in all of us talking, not so much the environmentalist, perhaps. The other issue I think with methane is, as Tanya was mentioning, so many of the sources are not point sources. It's the leak at the back of your, if you have a natural gas propane tank, or the fireplace, or wetlands, or the area that I've been working in, landfills. You have to try and address them much more holistically. The other issue that's coming out quite recently is that you have to be careful if you go after reducing methane. If you're not careful, the nitrous oxides may actually increase. So it's really a systems approach that's needed. We've got to reduce all of these greenhouse gases. The other comment that I would make about methane is that all of the sort of the greenhouse gas terminology that we have and where we are, and the potential warming that we're facing is all done with 100-year global warming potential for CO2. But if we say, hey, wait a second, what are we most concerned about as a community, global community? It's probably the next 30, 50, maybe 80 years, when methane has a much more impactful role. So it only makes sense to go after that first, because it has a much shorter life in the atmosphere, and it'll give us way more benefits. But as I mentioned, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because there aren't that many point sources. So we're getting there, but I think still unfortunately the knowledge isn't as robust as we would like. But I do think that that it's kind of an all hands on deck and all of the above in terms of mitigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think that's I mentioned David Patterson, who's helped sponsor these events this week, and I know that that's a concern he takes very seriously. That the short term mitigation, focusing on methane, simply makes sense. doesn't it? And nitrous oxide even more impactful greenhouse gas. But I'm not sure how focusing on methane too much can create more nitrous oxide emissions.
Yeah, there was a paper that just came out last week in Science that actually, I was just looking at the title, requires caution. And it's because it's so complicated that there are different types of bacteria. If you try to reduce the bacteria that's creating the methane, you may actually have more nitrous oxide produced. I'm sure Tanya knows more about that than me.
Yeah. Okay. Tanya, you can confirm that as a concern. Okay. Well, why don't we, Gavin, would any input into the conversation at this point?
Yeah, I'd like to make like two points which I think are relevant to some of the stuff that Dan was talking about. And the first thing that people need to know, and I'm sure we all know it here, but a lot of the impact of methane is not its direct greenhouse effect, but its impact on atmospheric chemistry. So it's an ozone precursor. And so ozone in the troposphere is also a greenhouse gas. And so much of the increase in ozone that we've seen over the industrial period has been driven by the rise in the background level of methane. And of course, ozone is a criteria pollutant and is extremely harmful for both crops and people. And so one of the co-benefits of reducing methane in the large is that it also reduces ozone and smog and other kinds of air pollution issues. So the co-benefits of reducing methane are actually quite large, not just on the temperature part of it. But there is a big complication which kind of goes against the Homo economicus argument that Dan arose, which is that there really isn't a clean conversion between the impacts of methane emissions and the impacts of carbon dioxide emissions. And the reason is that carbon dioxide, the impacts of carbon dioxide scale with the total amount of carbon dioxide that has ever been emitted, right? It accumulates in the atmosphere. And that means that the impacts in terms of temperature of carbon dioxide, you have to integrate back from today all the way back, right? Whereas the impacts of methane on temperature are really just a function of the emissions that there's been in the last 10 years, right? So one of them has this very, very long tail, and one of them has a very short period. And that means that when you try and trade off a carbon dioxide emission as compared to a methane emission, and that was built into the Kyoto Protocol. It's still part of the COP process, and they've effectively ignored all science kind of past like 1995 for assessing that. Because it's too complicated for them, but the science is really telling you something quite profound. If you say, okay, well, I'm going to emit as much carbon dioxide as I want, but just reduce methane, right? It's not a one-for-one thing. You have to keep reducing methane in order to match the amount of carbon dioxide that you're letting in, and so. So when we talk about net zero, right, we're only talking about net zero carbon dioxide, right? We're not talking about net zero greenhouse gases. We're not talking about net zero methane. We're talking about net zero carbon because that determines the temperature impact of carbon going forward, right? So when we get to net zero carbon, effectively the global warming due to increases in carbon will stabilize, right? So you need to get to net zero. Whereas if you're looking at the methane part, for the temperatures to stabilize, we just need to stop increasing, methane, right? So the methane that we have now is not quite in balance, but it's roughly a balance between what's coming in and what's being oxidized in the atmosphere. If we reduce the emissions a little bit, then we'd stabilize the methane, and then just like a little bit smaller, it would actually start to fall quite quickly. And so we can have quite dramatic temperature changes associated with methane because of current emissions, whereas for carbon dioxide, that isn't the case. Right, so those two trajectories, the difference between the accumulated carbon dioxide emissions making temperature, and then the current methane emissions making the temperature change, means that there's no clean trade-off between them that you can just assign a dollar value to, which is unfortunate. But I've kind of come to the conclusion that we just really need to have independent targets for these things, and that people should not be trading off methane emissions for carbon dioxide emissions. We need to reduce both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's I think there's a pretty broad consensus about that.
Well, you think?
Yeah, you think, but but maybe it was expedient, right, to pursue that. I'm glad you mentioned health. I mentioned my wife is flying to Baku this evening, and she's actually with the World Health Organization. So, and health they've made some inroads with getting health on the agenda, as you probably all know. Although this year I don't think she's going with as much optimism as usual, but last year it came out in the final declaration, and there are statistics indicating that significantly reducing methane by around 40% or so. The global methane pledge, I think, is 30% of 2020 levels by 2030, right? That this could have a very significant impact on reducing premature deaths, reducing asthma-related hospital visits, billions of hours of lost labor from extreme heat, and so on, because of the impact it would have on global warming. And we're also concerned about food security, of course, right? So maybe we can broaden the discussion a bit, but what are your biggest worries? I'll put it this way. Tanya, I'll turn to you. My biggest worries relate to the impact of climate change on human health and food security in general. Methane's a big part of that, obviously not the whole thing. But if I'm just asking each of you, perhaps, as people that have been looking at these issues for many years, what do you think, what keeps you awake at night when we worry about methane releases and climate change in general? Sonia, are you there with us?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Good.
What keeps me awake at night? So I do tend to think a bit smaller about this. I try not to get too worried in the bigger picture. But in general, I'm worried about so a lot of the degradation we've seen of our freshwaters, and I really concentrate on freshwaters, wetlands, etc., which are used for multiple purposes, right? Recreation, but also I am all for hydropower, etc. But hydropower reservoirs also emit methane, etc. So I'm a little bit worried about the degradation of our waters and continuing forward. There's going to be benefits, and I don't think the verdict is out yet, but this restoration that we're trying to do of wetlands, so even despite the fact that wetlands are a large methane emitter, in the long term, they are good for a number of reasons. In the long term, they are carbon sequesters. Some of the research in the last decades has said that it takes, though, a couple hundred years before we're actually at a point where wetlands are regularly sequestering enough carbon for it to be considered a carbon sink. So in the short term, we are restoring these wetlands, but essentially we're doing so to act as these filters for what's coming off of farms or urban centers. I'm saying stormwater ponds also as wetlands. Here in southwestern Ontario, we drain 90% of our wetlands for agriculture. And I don't think we're going to move away from that. So the push is to restore those wetlands as these filters. However, these are just restoring these these water bodies,
Mhm.
and it may end up being in massive amounts. And they're just continuing to be methane emitters. And they will be in the short term. And like Gavin was saying, in the short term, what we'd like to do is reduce methane emissions. So I am a little bit on edge with where we're going with this restoration. So I think that's probably what's at the top of my mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. You can't go to an international conference now of course, without discussing nature-based solutions, right? It's all the rage, and it sounds wonderful. And I know that Germany and many other countries have sunk some serious resources into it, but it is complicated, as you said. No matter what the topic, whether it's biodiversity conservation, or climate mitigation, adaptation, you name it. Yeah. So thanks so much for raising that concern. Tim, did you have a nightmare scenario for us?
Well, I'm just looking. I just checked out the current price of liquefied natural gas,
Yeah.
and it looks approximately to be the same price it was 24 years ago. It had gone up significantly, but now it's dirt cheap. And of course, look, all of us are thinking about horrific dystopian nightmare scenarios these days, to be quite honest. And when in an era of drill baby drill, or sort of not necessarily caring too much about this stuff, what we've got right now is really cheap liquefied natural gas. The Canadian government has a plan to cap it, right? Which seems it seems pretty. It's actually, in my opinion, the right thing to do, because I feel when you have a carbon tax, that those efficiency incentives kind of muddy it a bit. Carbon taxes are good; they do bring the emissions down, but there's that efficiency incentive that gets in the way. Whereas you just cap the amount that's allowed to get used, then that sort of breaks that very well. But that efficiency, that carbon cap, where I learned about it first was, I believe, in a TV ad by the Conservative Party of Canada, calling it the worst thing that the government's ever decided to do. It's going to put up your your prices for everything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you mix that with the cheap methane. I am a little bit freaked out. We haven't even talked about the agriculture issue now, but just specifically with that liquefied natural gas, for me, I have a lot of questions. I don't necessarily tend to appreciate technological solutions for environmental problems because they tend to backfire so often. But one question is, is there a way to sort of rein in this liquefied natural gas so that we have less point source leakages, or is that just dream world a kind of scenario? And what do you do in a scenario where you have liquefied natural gas currently at a 24-year low, and an ideology of baby drill coming in big time globally? That's my depressing question for everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think the temptation for any government to do whatever it can to keep food prices down is going to be extremely strong, right? And if that means further subsidizing the food industry, then I think we're going to see more and more of that. If it means depressing prices for fuel, I think we'll see more and more of that. It's going to be difficult to when we talk about, Tanya mentioned the impact, of course, of agricultural runoff, right? And rather than increasing limitations on the use of nitrogen and other fertilizers, I imagine we'll go the other way. So it is a I think there's a feedback loop here, to use a systems term, Dan, when it comes to food security as well. That's often overlooked, and we need to think about that seriously, especially if I mean, and the solution there might be, well, okay, let's move away from the kind of agricultural production system that we currently have on a global scale, and move towards a more plant-based agricultural system. That seems self-evident to me. But again, that's not necessarily what flies in terms of the agribusiness that's being affected by this. So, okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's those are all really interesting perspectives. Maybe I might open it up now for a more general conversation, and maybe just in terms of solutions. What do we do? How do we get out of this? I'm not asking for the answer, but just maybe some general thoughts to keep moving around in a circle, or if anyone wants to speak up, please just go ahead. Dan, what would you do? You're Prime Minister for a day.
I'd rather be mayor for a day.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about
I
cities.
sort of see things through a city perspective.
Yes.
And
yes.
the thing about a city, if you have wonderful parks but lots of crime, you haven't solved the issue. If you have wonderful buildings but it's completely congested, you haven't solved the problem. Mm-hmm. Managing a city, it's an emerging complex system. It's all of the above. It's dealing with humans, with all of our frailties and angst, and we're getting the governments that we actually are voting for around the world, which is a bit scary. But people are grumpy, and people are worried about affordability, and people are, I think, agitated about the way the world's going. On the other hand, we're just about to cross over the 7th planetary boundary. Ocean acidification. We know that we're headed in the wrong direction, and we know that all of these things are interrelated. And methane is a big one, and it's an immediate one that in theory we should be able to address, but it's going to require sort of all hands on deck. And I think it's all the food. Well, 80% of the food that's being grown is going to customers in cities. 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are for the customers in the cities. It's what we do, it's what we buy, it's what we want. And the people with the money tend to be the ones in the city. We also tend to be the ones who vote in different types of government. And there is a rural-urban split, but that's not that big of a driver, because especially in the US and Canada, rural people are just as rich as urban people. So I think it's learning how to get along within cities and then translating that to these complex environmental challenges. So we're not going to solve methane without also addressing CO2, or without also addressing biodiversity, or without also addressing fresh water. It's trying to move in the right direction with a lot more civility, and I would argue maybe it sounds a lot more kindness. We got to figure out how to get along with each other and then with the planet. So yeah, I would start with being mayor for a day, and it would only be a day. I know I would be voted out pretty quickly with that campaign line.
Okay, but yeah, thanks for bringing cities into the discussion directly, and maybe to individual utility or efficiency, efficacy. What can individuals do, right? I wanted to come back to that question, but just on the broader scale, Gavin, what sort of solutions do you think from your end? I know that measurement's very important. That we want to increase that. We want to have a more trustworthy, perhaps, perspective of what's actually happening, right, in terms of emissions. Right. But any broader comments?
Well, I mean, not broader comments, but like following on again from Dan's points. I live in New York City. There's a couple of things that have happened here over the last few decades that I think are useful from a reduction in methane standpoint. One of them is that almost all the big landfills have been closed, and the landfills have been capped and are now actually producing biogas, the methane that would have gone into the atmosphere, and now they're being used for local power sources. So Staten Island had the largest landfill in the world in the Fresh Skills now park, but now it's actually producing methane that's being used directly to heat homes and the like. The other thing, which is kind of new work that's being done by my colleagues at Columbia University, is that if you go around the city with very precise sensors, what you find is that there is far more leakage from the urban infrastructure that's transporting natural gas around than people have previously thought. I mean, really, really high levels. And you can walk down the street and you can say, okay, well, no, it's this building, it's this building. It's like, you have a drone that's kind of like going over the building. I mean, and you can really track this stuff very, very, very closely. And with that information, you have actions that you can take, because, I mean, the whole point about detecting the leaks from space for the very big emissions, it says, okay, well, it's coming from there, go fix that one thing. The cities, it's a much more distributed issue, and the leaks are much smaller proportionately, but they are all tackleable. I mean, so cities have to track what each individual building is doing. Like New York keeps track of which individual building has scaffolding, which individual building has bits of its facade falling into the street, which individual building is polluting the water. I mean, it keeps track of everything on a building by building basis. And here the buildings are very compact, they're very high density housing, and so it makes sense. It makes sense to do that. Maybe it doesn't quite make so much sense in somewhere like Toronto or London, but in the dense urban cores, people with better information can make better decisions and choices. And I think that there is some non-negligible scope there for both reducing methane and then the consequent smog and ozone levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that there is a brilliant opportunity because of the need to renew infrastructure, right? And that goes for any city that's been around for a while, of course. I think there's but without the commensurate willingness to spend money on that, we end up going around in circles, perhaps. But incentives for the private sector to get involved there as well. Okay, yeah. Sorry, were you going to add something? Yeah, Tim.
I just noticed that David Patterson put a kind of big time question in the chat.
Yeah,
and it's, I mean, it's huge, and it comes to sort of a lot of more big picture. David asks here, given the first law of thermodynamics, which we know all increases in energy ends up as low-grade heat, is there any way to address the climate issues without eliminating the growth goal of our global society? And of course, that's just massive. I think David, partially, I have a lot of sympathies with this. David's after my heart here, I guess, a little bit with this question, because as I noted with the example of cruise ships, we can go for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, for example, have all these wonderful outcomes, food security outcomes, health, well-being outcomes, et cetera, but in their number, I forget which particular number it is, it also has growth and jobs, right? And that's an environmental economics approach to attacking issues of sustainability, but there's another approach, the ecological economics approach, that goes some more like this. Like we've known for years, decades and decades, we have enough wealth, we have enough food on the planet. If we just redistribute it, we don't have to grow our economies at all. And allied and sort of sitting somewhere between these approaches is, what is growth anyway? Like, what is this gross domestic product thing? How are we adding it up?
Yeah.
Does it even make sense that when two airplanes fly into the World Trade Center and take those buildings down, that registers as an increase in economic growth for our, for the United States of America in that case. Like, and of course, ecological damage is not counted, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of what growth is in there as well. But so to David's question, I think it's a suggestion like, okay, if somebody said we should not have a cruise ship industry, I would kind of have to say, yeah, that's pretty reasonable when you look at the numbers. That would make a lot of people angry, especially people who have a lot invested in the cruise ship industry. You could probably say a similar thing about the meat industry. Actually, we know we can solve some pretty big problems if we come in a sort of imagine ourselves as dictators, come in in a heavy-handed way and say, well, no more meat because we can save the world this way or something like that. I mean, those aren't ways of getting to the issue that I would necessarily condone. However, one could imagine that we could get to a place as humans, Dan kind of went in this direction a little bit, where we just think, okay, like, let's just do a little bit more sharing and improve our relationships with the planet and with each other, and then we can get to a place where we're like, well, what are we really trying to do here with humanity? We're trying to improve these particular things that I know Dan in particular has done a lot of thinking of. What is better for a human, and do we start looking into things like, okay, well, what about a basic income? Why do we always have to work increasing hours a week in order to make more money so that the S&P 500 keeps growing and things like that? And I think there's a big picture issue here that I'd love to hear your comments on, because it's a very contentious issue, obviously.
Yeah, thanks for Tim, and yeah, thanks David for raising that question. Thanks also to Jason Jackson, who's put something in the chat about a company with try to make a difference, definitely. But Gavin, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a sense of proportion, right? So we do produce waste heat through all the things that we do, but the amount of waste heat that we're producing is about almost 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the radiative forcing that's warming the planet because of the greenhouse gas concentrations. So if waste heat was the only thing that we had to worry about, we wouldn't be worrying about it at all. So while one might imagine some planet-spanning civilization like Trantor or something like that, where this is a big issue. A reference there to Isaac Asimov, for those who are paying attention. That's where we're like 200 times too small for that to be an issue right now. So, I'm all for thinking holistically about everything, but I'm also for looking at the biggest issues and tackling the biggest issues. And when you're talking orders of magnitude, there's a big difference between the issues associated with concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the waste heat that was generated while you were burning them. Right.
Although you can relate the former to economic growth as well, of course. Right. It's there's no way to escape the discussion, I think, ultimately. But yeah, okay. So let's keep the discussion going just for a few more minutes, if you don't mind. I know it's a Tuesday evening, and I thank everyone for staying, or Wednesday evening. Yeah. Tonya, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about one issue which I think can contribute a bit to will contribute to our aim for net zero, and that's a bigger push in the hydropower sector. So Canada runs about 60% of their electricity comes from hydro energy. Yeah. And so I am part of a big project in which we are visiting. We're partners with Hydro-Quebec, Ontario Power Generation, Manitoba Hydro, and BC Hydro, which are four of the biggest producers in Canada, at least for hydropower, and trying to improve the very basic statistical models that are used right now for estimating the greenhouse gas emissions from the hydropower. So this is an interesting topic. I just want to point out a few key things. So like I said, all natural waters and unnatural waters produce methane and CO2. And so there's been a lot of research into this actually since the 90s in Quebec mostly. And a big impetus for that research, the only impetus really for that research, was the fact that the United States wanted to buy more carbon, free sources, more cleaner sources.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there's going to be quite a big push for that going forward. I was just at the Water Power Canada conference in Ottawa a few weeks ago. And yeah, there's some big players in the United States that are going to be pushing for a lot more of our Canadian hydroelectric. Like Quebec, I think at least is thinking about 5,000 more kilometers of transmission lines, for example. So anyway, I think it's a good transition for the electricity sector. And I will also say that, yes, there are methane emissions that are produced, but there are ways that the industry's been trying to prevent those going forward. And in general, climate has a lot, let's say climate geographic region in terms of climate has a lot to do with those emissions. So Canada, we're actually on the lower end when it comes to those emissions. So we're in a good space for that.
Yeah. So there's no energy source without cost, right? Whether it's environmental or cost to local communities as well. So you're well aware, Tanya, of course, of the controversies, I'll put it that way, right, over large dam construction, for example. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not going to downplay those whatsoever. A lot of our reservoirs in Canada end up in Indigenous lands, etc. So there's a lot of issues that go around with that, and besides the ecological,
Yeah, it's something that I'm increasingly concerned about, but I have been for many years, really. What are the costs of the so-called green transition, right? Whether it's the construction of dams or the use of critical minerals, which are useful for electric batteries, but we're seeing already causing problems. Hydrogen plants that are being built in Namibia, for example, to ship hydrogen to Europe to power their green transition, but they're causing some issues at the local points. And so nothing comes without costs, and I think we all need to make decisions, which maybe I can just sort of finish off there in terms of asking everyone to think about, the individuals. Still have quite a few people on the call, and many more will watch this recorded. I'm just wondering what you think, and just maybe do a round table here, that individuals can do, right? What difference can the average person make in terms of turning back the time? We don't have to focus on methane so much. We've obviously broadened out. Someone has asked a specific question. Professor Harkins from Ontario Tech University asks, does anyone have any thoughts on how to convince people to stop prioritizing their preference for eating meat over the future of our planet? So that might be one thing that we can do, we can look at. And certainly that's not an easy one either. I know that there have been years and years now of commercial conditioning to convince people that meat consumption is a vital part of their lifestyle. So it's a very difficult one, Professor Harkins, I readily admit. But I think that organizations like Common Earth and others are certainly pushing the message out. And there has been maybe a slowly transition that's taking place. I think also, as I mentioned earlier, the struggle over providing food security will drive more and more realization that a meat-based agricultural system just does not make sense on a global scale. Unfortunately, though, there might be a great deal of even more displacement and violence associated with that. So I'm one of those climate war people. I don't see it the cause of World War III, don't get me wrong, but it certainly will have an impact, in what I call equal violence will take place. But maybe we can just do a one more roundtable then, and concluding thoughts, but in particular maybe with the focus on that question of, what can we do as individuals? And I can just go up and down my list again and start with Dan.
Sure. I think as individuals we have to. It's little, big. So we have to think big picture, but we also have to keep in mind that little things add up in a big way. So it is thinking about what we eat, and if we're going to die on the hill that we have to have a hamburger, then so be it. But maybe we buy a smaller car, or maybe we think about having a house that isn't heated with natural gas. And then I think it's sort of a gradational thought process from there. So it's supporting the municipality to try and have new houses not heated with natural gas. It's trying to reduce the carbon intensity of our electricity. It's trying to move to better mobility options that we don't only get around with cars. And then I think for me, the big picture is I first look at things as a geologist, and geologists have the luxury of, the planet's 5 billion years old. But what we've done in the last 100 years to the planet is kind of geological equivalent of hitting it with an asteroid. The rate of biodiversity loss, the rate of temperature increases, the planet really hasn't seen this before. And the next 100 years, we know that we're going to be seeing significant changes. Population will stop growing, probably beyond 2080. So we're already at the point where we can start thinking, the Hannah Ritchie book of, that things aren't that bad. And we should think about how we use these little things to get us into sustainability. But the transition, I think, is the challenge, because we're all going to be trying to figure out how to slow the process, how to lobby against change. But this change is coming. It's inevitable. The world will stop growing people. We will have all sorts of other challenges to deal with, changes to the climate, other geopolitical issues. But the communities that we're in are going to have to be the ones that drive this agenda beyond the next 50 years. And we can start thinking about it now. And it does, maybe it doesn't really seem reality, but from what we put on our plate to, what's going to be happening 50 years, it's a continuum. And I think that's the way to look at it as an individual.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Little, big. Right? Gavin, any thoughts, closing thoughts?
Sure. I like to remind people that we wear many hats. We are consumers, but we're also parents. We're members of our faith groups. We are commuters. We are voters. We are letter writers. We are conversationalists. And getting people to understand the concerns that we have, you can perhaps have a lot more impact affecting a bigger decision by organizing letter writing campaigns to your local utility than perhaps you can by doing a little bit more recycling. I'd like to emphasize again Dan's point on mobility. People don't give electric bikes enough credit. Everyone's talking about electric vehicles, but the biggest electric vehicle rise that you're seeing that is totally unsubsidized and right now kind of going underneath the radar is the rise of electric bikes for commuting and for carrying people around. We have an electric cargo bike. I take my daughter to school every day. It's faster than driving, far less polluting, and I can keep it in the basement. And the more that we make our cities friendly for those kinds of options, and reduce the number of cars in the city and the damage that they cause, both in terms of human life, accidents, and pollution, then the better the cities are to live in, the more dense they become.
I think we lost Gavin at that point, but I think we know where he was going. Right? Maybe he hopped on his electric bike. took off. All pertinent thoughts, obviously. And
All right. Well, I was done anyway. That was fine.
okay, thank you. Yeah, we wonderful. And yeah, I was thinking of the electric bike market in China, for example, and what a tremendous impact that it can make if they can focus on that. Despite what they're doing with cars, with electric cars, it's the electric bike, I think, that's the future. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. And Tonya, any last thoughts or directives for us?
Yeah, Gavin kind of stole mine a bit. I I was gonna say, yeah, so we are a one car family, so we do have a car because we need it. It's not an EV or a hybrid yet, but it probably will be in the future. And yeah, we bike as much as we can to work. I bike my son to daycare as now, and not an electric bike. I'm sure later on it'll be an electric bike, and you know. But for now, I'm doing it with my own power for exercise as well. And I think one issue is that I actually am American, so I grew up in New Jersey, and I did not jump on the bike bandwagon, or I was very much a car person until I moved to Europe for 10 years, and so that's actually what changed a lot of my thinking. And so I think we are just in North America so bound to this car thing, unfortunately, and it's only in the cities where you can actually enjoy it. We do not have the mass transit that was beautiful in Switzerland to use. So, yeah, I think that would be one thing that I would love to see going forward. I try and take a train when I go to Montreal for meetings and stuff, and it's a pain in the butt. Kind of like to get from where I am to Toronto, they only go a certain time. Like it's very annoying. And so that kind of system I think would be very useful. But for the meantime, I try and do it, in a family household where we reduce that car and we stick to the bike, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you. But let's not forget the value, I think, of the research that everyone here does as well, and what that contributes. And so I'm a typical educator, I guess. And my response to this question is always, get educated and try and educate others as well. Don't forget that part of the equation, the whole communication aspect, right, which we're, I think, taking literally tonight with this project, with this panel. Tim, sorry, did you have any other last minute comments, Tim?
Yeah, I'm gonna just address Lee's comment. Lee basically said, "Well, how do you get people to eat, less?"
Yeah.
And to Lee, I would say, well, we need some psychologists on this. First thing, Lee is Dr. Harkins is a psychologist, so I'm working on her there. But I mean, there's a whole field of environmental psychology. There's idea of a worldview transformations, and toward. And we know that people who have a greater sense of this thing called nature awareness, or nature relatedness, tend to do more recycling. They tend to eat plant-based more often and things like that, and those things can change, and we know that those things can change people's ideas of what to eat and how to act. We know that because they've been changing all along, because we've been the subject of a large amount of psychological engineering way back from the beginning of when Edward Bernays, who is Sigmund Freud's nephew, I believe, really created Western the consumer culture by tricking us into believing we need bacon and eggs for breakfast and things like that, and tricking women into thinking that they should smoke because they're called torches of freedom, and et cetera, et cetera. We've had a lot of psychological manipulation, and we can push back at that and try and do our own studies. But another thing is, if you take the subsidy off of a Big Mac, which 2 years ago in the States apparently cost $5. You take the subsidies off of that Big Mac costs $13. Why are those things subsidized so much? And you go also to the grocery store and you want to buy a pack of 6 Beyond Burgers. unprepared, that costs you $20. Why is that not subsidy? So we've had a mix of manipulation based on subsidy and based on actual psychology happen for a long time, and we really try and stay away from that in science and academia, because we think, well, we can't go manipulating people. We leave that to what? Marketers. And we leave that, and and people complain about carbon taxes, but they don't complain about subsidies to large animal agriculture. So a lot of things that we can do as policies and but also as scientists, and especially psychologists, Lee. So I appreciate that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, human behavior is at the heart of this, and so it's a big part of the solution, of course. So I wanted to thank everyone very much for coming and offering your views tonight. Thank everyone in the audience for some of the comments that were made in the chat. Didn't have time to get quite to all of them, but nonetheless. Yeah, all the best in your future work and research, and let's keep the spotlight on methane anyways. I know it'll come out of COP29. There'll be more talking about methane that'll come out, but I think we've sophisticated everyone in the audience tonight as to how they interpret those results. I'll put it that way. So thanks very much, and all the best.
Thanks, everyone.